I saw Hannah Collins before I even turned off the engine. She was standing beneath the streetlight between our two townhouses, alone in the falling snow, both hands tucked into the pockets of a dark wool coat. The yellow light caught the snow collecting in her hair and along her shoulders, and for a few seconds I just sat there with my hands still on the steering wheel. I had lived next door to Hannah for almost 6 months. I had seen her carrying groceries, dragging recycling bins to the curb, fighting with a frozen car door, and once chasing an empty cardboard box halfway down the street in slippers. I knew she was attractive. That was not new information. But something about seeing her perfectly still beneath that light made my brain behave as if we had never met before. My name is Lucas Grant. I was 29 then, and most weeknights I came home late enough that the neighborhood had already gone quiet. That night had been no different until I turned onto my street. I had spent 10 hours dealing with delayed shipments, incorrect inventory numbers, and people who considered copying 6 coworkers into an email a form of emergency response. By the time I parked, my ambitions for the evening were dinner, a shower, and possibly falling asleep before deciding what to watch. Instead, I was staring through my windshield at the woman next door, while snow drifted through the light around her. Hannah eventually turned her head toward my car. Even from 20 feet away, I could tell she had caught me. That should have been enough to make a sensible man look busy. I was apparently not a sensible man that night. I got out and shut the door behind me. The snow made everything unusually quiet, muting the road and the houses until even my footsteps sounded too loud. Hannah watched me approach with a small smile. Snow had melted against her cheeks, and a few damp strands of brown hair rested near her face. "You planning to stand there all night?" I asked. She looked around as if considering it. Maybe. Then her eyes came back to me and narrowed with amusement. "You were staring. I was parking. For a very long time. Complex procedure." Her smile widened. She took one hand from her pocket, brushed snow from her sleeve, and tilted her head slightly. "Do I look pretty tonight?" She clearly expected me to joke. Normally I would have. Hannah and I had spent months communicating mostly through harmless neighbor sarcasm. She once told me my lawn looked tired. I informed her that her porch plants had abandonment issues. Nothing between us had ever required courage. But standing there, with her cheeks pink from the cold and snow caught in her hair, every clever answer I could have used suddenly felt cheap. "Yeah," I said. "You do." Hannah's expression changed so quickly I almost smiled. The confident little tease disappeared for half a second, leaving her genuinely surprised. "Oh," she said. I put my hands into my coat pockets. "You asked, I know. I just expected something annoying. I can try again if you want." She laughed softly and looked down at the snow near her boots. "No, that one was okay. I should have gone inside after that." My house was 15 steps away, and I could already imagine the heating bill escaping through every window because I had left the thermostat low all day. Instead, I stopped beside Hannah under the streetlight. For a while, neither of us said anything. I looked up as the snow moved through the yellow light in slow, uneven patterns. Hannah did the same. It surprised me how comfortable the silence was. With most people, silence created an obligation. Someone eventually reached for a question or a story just to prove the interaction had not failed. Hannah seemed perfectly content to let nothing happen for a minute. "You okay?" I asked eventually. She nodded at first, then gave me a look that suggested she knew I would notice the answer was incomplete. "Yeah, just a little homesick tonight." I had known she moved here for work, but we had never talked much about what she had left behind. "Family?" She nodded. "My mom called. My brother and his wife were over. My dad was making chili. Everybody was talking over everybody else." She smiled, but there was a quieter expression underneath it. Then we hung up, and my house felt really, really quiet. I looked toward her townhouse. One lamp glowed behind the front window. "So you came outside. The silence feels different out here." She held out her palm and watched snow disappear against her skin. "When I was little, my dad used to take us outside whenever the first good snow came. Even if it was late." There was no tragedy in the way she said it. She simply missed something that still existed somewhere else. I could have told her she would adjust. I could have said moving away was hard or offered one of those phrases people use when they want to solve a feeling quickly. Instead, I stayed beside her. Hannah did not seem to need advice. She needed the streetlight, the snow, and maybe another person standing nearby so the night did not feel quite so empty. After a while, she glanced at me. "You don't have to freeze because I'm having a nostalgic moment." "I'm not freezing. Your ears are red. That's their natural color. You should see a doctor." I smiled. "There she is." Hannah bumped her shoulder lightly against mine, then went quiet again. We stood there another few minutes before the cold finally won. Hannah turned toward her front steps and pulled her keys from her pocket. Thanks for staying. I accomplished almost nothing. Exactly. She smiled at me from the bottom step. You're very easy to be quiet with, Lucas. I put a hand over my chest. That might be the nicest way anyone has ever called me boring. Hannah stopped halfway up the steps and looked back. Her smile softened. I didn't say boring. Then she went inside before I could decide what to do with that. The next evening, I came home at almost the same time. I pulled into my driveway, shut off the engine, and looked toward Hannah's house before I even reached for my bag. Her porch light was on. The lamp behind her front window was glowing too, warm against the dark winter street. I sat there for a second, realizing I had checked without thinking. That was when I understood the night before had not ended beneath the streetlight. Something had followed me home. After that, nothing dramatic happened. There was no sudden confession, no accidental kiss, no reason for either of us to admit that a few quiet minutes beneath a streetlight had changed anything. Life simply kept moving, and somehow Hannah kept appearing inside mine. 2 mornings later, I woke to fresh snow covering both driveways and found her outside in a knitted hat, attacking the edge of hers with a plastic shovel that looked designed for a child. I had already started my snowblower, so I cleared the strip between our homes and took care of the worst section near her garage. Hannah stood with both hands resting on the shovel handle and watched me finish. You know this means I owe you something now. I accept cash. I was thinking gratitude. That has terrible resale value. She disappeared inside before I could say anything else and returned 5 minutes later with a travel mug of coffee. Fine payment. I took it, surprised to find she remembered I drank mine with no sugar. She noticed the look on my face. You're not mysterious, Lucas. You carry the same coffee into your car every morning. I told myself that explained why it felt strangely good that she had noticed. Small things followed. Hannah texted me one afternoon because a package was scheduled to arrive while she was meeting a client across town, so I carried it inside my place until she returned. A week later, she brought in 2 boxes that had been left on my porch while I was working late and sent me a picture of them beside her couch with the message, "Your possessions have defected." I replied that they had better living conditions there. She told me that was probably true. None of it was romantic enough to point at, which somehow made it easier for both of us to keep doing it. The distance between our front doors was maybe 30 feet. More and more often, one of us found a reason to cross it. Hannah began noticing my schedule before I noticed hers. One Thursday night, I came home after 10 p.m. and found her standing on my porch holding a covered bowl. "This is becoming alarming," I said as I unlocked the door. "You've been home after 10 nights this week. Are you monitoring me? Your headlights shine directly into my living room." Convenient excuse. She held out the bowl, soup. I took it and lifted the lid just enough to smell tomato and basil. Should I be worried? "Only if you plan to eat another frozen dinner." I looked at her. "You've been monitoring my freezer too? I saw you carrying 6 of them inside last Sunday." She stepped backward toward her house. "You are 29 years old. Frozen lasagna cannot be your emergency contact." I laughed, but after she went home, I stood in my kitchen eating her soup and realized nobody had noticed how late I was coming home in a very long time. The pattern worked both ways. I learned Hannah usually worked at the little desk near her front window in the evenings, because the lamp there stayed on long after the rest of her house went dark. I learned she called her mother most Wednesday nights and her brother almost every Sunday. Sometimes I would see her pacing past the window while she talked, smiling with the full expression she rarely used around anyone else. I also learned that when she had a difficult day, she tended to sit on her front steps for 10 minutes before going inside. I never asked how I knew. When you live next door to someone long enough, observation starts pretending to be coincidence. One Sunday morning, I opened my front door and found Hannah halfway across the narrow stretch between our homes with 2 coffees in her hands. "Before you say anything," she called. "This is not repayment, then I'm suspicious. I bought one for myself and accidentally purchased a second one specifically the way you like it. Common mistake." She sat on my front step without asking, so I put on my coat and joined her. The sun was out, but piles of snow still lined the street, bright enough to make everything look cleaner than it actually was. For a while we drank coffee and watched a man 2 houses down attempt to convince his dog to wear boots. The dog was winning. Hannah eventually rested her elbows on her knees. "My mom asked yesterday if I'm coming home. For a visit?" She meant permanently. I looked at her. She did not seem upset, exactly. More thoughtful. What did you say? I said no. She took a sip of coffee. Then I felt guilty for saying it that quickly. I waited. Hannah had taught me that if I left enough room, she usually filled it with whatever she actually meant. I miss them, she continued. A lot. Sometimes I still wake up here, and for about 3 seconds I forget I moved. But I also like my job. I like having my own place. I like figuring things out without calling my dad every time something makes a weird noise. You called me when your furnace made a weird noise. You live 30 feet away. That is different. Your dad would probably dispute that. She smiled, then looked toward the street again. I guess I thought leaving would eventually stop feeling like leaving. I understood what she meant better than I knew how to say. Instead of trying, I rested my coffee between my hands and stayed beside her. A delivery truck passed slowly at the end of the block. Somewhere nearby, someone was scraping ice from a windshield. Hannah did not seem uncomfortable with the silence, and neither was I. After a while, she leaned lightly against my shoulder, not enough to make it a moment, just enough that I noticed the warmth through both our coats. "You know," she said, "you're very easy to be quiet with." I looked down at her, again with the insults. It's a compliment. It sounds like a polite way to say I provide very little entertainment. Hannah lifted her head and studied me with that soft expression she had worn under the streetlight. I didn't say boring. This time neither of us laughed immediately. She kept looking at me, and I became aware of how close we were sitting, how her knee rested against mine, how easy it would have been to turn a comfortable morning into something neither of us could pretend was neighborly. Then Hannah smiled, bumped my shoulder with hers, and rescued both of us by asking whether I thought the dog down the street had finally surrendered. I followed her gaze and let the moment pass. But later that week, I came home after another long day and realized Hannah's house was dark. Her car was gone. I knew she had mentioned dinner with coworkers, so there was no reason for it to bother me. Still, I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and felt the evening fall strangely flat. That was when I understood I had started measuring a good day, partly by whether I saw Hannah before it ended. By late February, Hannah and I had stopped pretending every visit needed a reason. Sometimes she came over because I had cooked too much pasta. Sometimes I ended up at her place because she wanted an opinion on 2 versions of the same ad copy and claimed my lack of marketing expertise made me unbiased. More often, one of us simply crossed the short stretch between our doors because the other person was home. A few evenings ended with Hannah asleep on the far end of my couch, while some movie continued playing to an audience of 1. I would turn the volume down, cover her with a throw blanket, and go back to whatever I was doing without trying to make the gesture mean more than it did. The problem was that almost everything had started meaning more than it used to. I noticed it in stupid places first. When something ridiculous happened at work, Hannah became the person I wanted to tell before I had even driven home. If I passed a bakery she liked, I bought 2 pastries without deciding to. When her car was missing from the driveway, I wondered where she was, then immediately told myself I had no business wondering. Hannah had changed too, though not in any dramatic way. She stopped saying she was going home when she meant visiting her parents and started saying she was going back to see my family. The first time I heard it, she did not seem to notice. I did. One Saturday evening she was sitting at my kitchen table, finishing something on her laptop while I made dinner. She had been there almost 3 hours, and neither of us had invited the other to anything. At some point she kicked off her socks because my floor was warm, complained that my knives were dull, and drank from the mug she had quietly started leaving in my cabinet. It struck me that 6 months earlier, I barely knew what she did for work. Now I knew which version of her silence meant concentration, which meant irritation, and which meant she was tired but refusing to admit it. I also knew I liked having her there enough that the thought made me uncomfortable. Then one night in early March, it started snowing again. I was halfway through washing a plate when someone knocked on my front door. Hannah stood outside wearing boots, jeans, and the same dark wool coat she had worn the night everything changed for me. Snow was already dusting her hair. "It's snowing," she said. I looked over her shoulder at the very obvious weather. I noticed. She smiled like she had been waiting for exactly that answer. "Come outside with me." I grabbed my coat and followed her without asking why. She walked past both driveways toward the streetlight, the same one she had been standing under months earlier when I came home exhausted and forgot how to be normal. The snow was lighter this time, falling in slow flakes that caught the yellow light before disappearing against the pavement. Hannah stopped beneath it and turned toward me. "You're staring again. I'm observing. You use that word whenever you get caught." I put my hands into my coat pockets. "Are you going to ask me the question again?" She knew immediately what I meant. Her smile became smaller, almost shy. "Do I look pretty tonight, that one?" She took a few steps closer. No, I already know your answer." That was the moment the old version of our relationship finally stopped making sense to me. Hannah had not wandered outside because her house felt lonely. She had knocked on my door. She had come specifically to get me, then brought me back to the place where I had first looked at her differently. There was no practical favor hiding underneath it. No package, coffee, snow shovel, work question, or dinner excuse. Just Hannah standing in front of me with snow settling on her shoulders again, watching to see what I would do when she made the invitation impossible to misunderstand. I could have kissed her. The thought arrived clearly enough that I knew I wanted to, but it also felt too easy to let the streetlight do all the work for us again. Instead, I took one hand out of my pocket and held it between us. Hannah looked down at it, then up at me. For the first time since I had known her, she did not hide behind a joke. She slipped her hand into mine and let our fingers settle together. Her hand was cold from being outside, but she did not pull away when I closed mine around it. We stood like that beneath the falling snow, and the silence between us was different now. Not empty, not uncertain, full of something we both finally understood. Hannah moved a little closer until our shoulders touched. "Still easy to be quiet with," she said. "I'm building an impressive résumé." She laughed softly, but she kept holding my hand. A few days later, an email arrived while I was at work. It was an offer from a larger logistics company in Chicago, one I had spoken with months earlier and almost forgotten about. Better title, better salary, bigger operation. The kind of opportunity I normally would have evaluated with a spreadsheet and accepted before anyone had time to ask how I felt about it. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. For the first time, the question was not whether the job was better. It was what leaving would mean. For the rest of that afternoon, the offer sat open on my second monitor while I pretended to work around it. Chicago meant a bigger operation, a better title, and enough of a salary increase that the sensible version of me should have already been calculating rent and commute times. 2 years earlier, I probably would have accepted before dinner. I had spent most of my adult life treating forward movement as something measurable. More money meant forward. More responsibility meant forward. A larger city and a better title definitely looked forward on paper. The problem was that every time I imagined packing my house into boxes, the first image that came to mind was Hannah's, standing in her driveway, watching a moving truck pull away. I told her 2 nights later. She was at my kitchen table with one leg folded beneath her, eating takeout noodles from the carton while I stood at the counter, pretending I needed to reorganize soy sauce packets. "I got a job offer," I said. Hannah looked up immediately. "Good one?" "Very." I told her the basics, keeping my voice deliberately practical. Chicago. Larger company, better salary, more responsibility. They wanted an answer within 10 days. Hannah listened without interrupting, and the longer I talked, the more I became aware that I sounded like a man presenting quarterly results, instead of discussing whether he was about to move 400 miles away from the woman whose hand I had held beneath the snow 3 nights earlier. When I finished, Hannah set her carton down. "That sounds like a big opportunity. It is. Congratulations." Her smile was real, which somehow made the next few seconds harder. I nodded and started explaining that the cost of living would be higher, but the salary difference more than covered it, and that Chicago would put me closer to several major distribution hubs. Hannah let me get through another minute of information before she asked, "Do you want to go?" I stopped. "It would be good for my career. I know, the company is growing fast, Lucas." Her voice stayed gentle. "Do you want to go?" I opened my mouth and realized I had no answer ready because I had not actually asked myself that question. I had asked whether the job was objectively better. I had asked whether turning it down would look unambitious. I had wondered whether refusing more money at 29 was the sort of decision I would regret at 39. What I had not done was picture myself waking up in Chicago and ask whether I wanted that life. Hannah looked down at her hands. "You don't have to make the decision based on me. I know. I mean it. I'm not going to ask you to stay." There was no anger in her voice and no attempt to make herself smaller so I would reassure her. That was almost worse. She was leaving the choice completely mine. I sat across from her. "Would you want me to?" Hannah gave me a tired little smile. That's not fair. Why? Because if I tell you yes and you stay, I'll always wonder if you wanted to. If I tell you no because I'm trying to be mature, I'll be lying. She picked up her noodles again but did not eat them. So figure out what you want, Lucas. Then tell me. I wanted her to make it easier. I wanted her to say something dramatic enough that staying would feel like courage and leaving would feel like betrayal. Instead, she finished dinner, kissed my cheek for the first time before she left, and walked the 30 feet back to her house without giving me anyone to blame for the decision. The next few days were uncomfortable in ways I probably needed. I talked with the company in Chicago. I talked with my current manager. I went home and looked at my kitchen, my living room, the front window that faced Hannah's place, and tried to separate fear of change from actual desire. My current company had been discussing expanding my role for months, but I had never pushed the conversation because I assumed the better opportunity would eventually exist somewhere else. When I finally asked what staying could look like, my manager offered me responsibility for a new regional operation with occasional travel and a promotion that was smaller than Chicago's, but far from insignificant. The important part was not that Minneapolis suddenly produced a perfect competing offer. It was that I realized I had options because I had finally bothered to ask for one. I turned Chicago down on Friday afternoon. Then I spent another hour at my desk, making sure I understood why before I went home. I was not staying because Hannah needed rescuing from loneliness. She had built a life here before I became important to it, and she would have kept building one if I left. I was staying because when I imagined the life I actually wanted rather than the resume I thought I was supposed to want, it had familiar streets in it. It had my family within driving distance, work I still cared about, a house I liked, and a woman next door whose porch light I had started looking for without realizing when that habit began. Hannah opened her door before I could knock a second time. She was wearing sweatpants and an old university sweatshirt, her hair twisted loosely behind her head. "You look serious." I turned it down. She went still. I watched several reactions move across her face before she settled on one. Because of me? No. The answer came quickly enough that she blinked. I stepped inside when she moved aside. Not like that. She waited, and I understood this was one of those moments where trying to sound impressive would only ruin it. I kept planning my life like there was nobody I wanted to come home to, I said. Hannah did not move. Every decision was about what came next. Better job, bigger thing, whatever looked like progress. Then I pictured leaving, and for the first time I didn't care whether the next thing looked better. I cared whether I wanted the life attached to it. Her eyes had gone bright, but she stayed quiet. I continued. I asked for more responsibility here. I got it. I'm not giving up my career. I'm just done pretending the only way forward is away from everything I actually want. Hannah looked at me for a long moment. And now, she asked. I stepped closer. Now there is someone I want to come home to. Her breath caught, and the smile that appeared was nothing like the playful one she had worn beneath the streetlight months earlier. Hannah reached for the front of my coat and pulled me the last few inches toward her. Our first kiss was quiet, warm, and almost ridiculously ordinary compared with how much it changed. When we separated, she kept one hand against my chest and whispered, "For someone easy to be quiet with, you took long enough." I laughed and kissed her again. After that, we stopped calling whatever existed between us neighborly. We dated properly, although living 30 feet apart made some parts of dating absurdly convenient. Hannah still had her own home, her own work, and a family she visited whenever she could. I still had long days, occasional travel, and a tendency to answer emails later than any reasonable person should. But more and more evenings ended with one of us crossing that little stretch between our doors, and eventually the question stopped being whether we were building something together. The only question was how far that something would go. "It's a girl," the nurse said, and for a second I forgot how to breathe. She was standing beside me in a hospital room, washed in pale morning light, holding something impossibly small against a white blanket. I had spent the last several hours pretending I was useful, fetching water, adjusting pillows, answering questions Hannah was too tired to answer, and discovering that there are few things more humbling than watching the woman you love do something you cannot possibly help her do. Then the nurse placed our daughter into my arms, and every thought I had prepared disappeared. She weighed almost nothing. Her face was pink and scrunched with outrage, one tiny fist pressed against her cheek, and I held her with the terrified concentration of a man who had suddenly been handed the most important thing in the world. A lot had happened since the night Hannah opened her front door, and I finally told her I wanted a life I could come home to. Enough years had passed that the two townhouses where we started had become part of a story we told, rather than the place we still lived, we dated. We learned that living 30 feet apart was convenient until an argument made 30 feet feel much farther than it was. We took trips to see her family, and eventually her father stopped asking whether I knew how to drive in winter weather. I proposed without a crowd. Hannah said yes before I finished what I had planned to say, and we got married surrounded by both our families. We bought a house together after that, one with an extra bedroom we told everyone was an office, because neither of us wanted to explain how often we had quietly imagined something else. Life did not become perfect. It became shared, which was better. Now Hannah Collins was Hannah Grant, though she still used Collins professionally, because she said changing every account and email signature sounded like administrative punishment. She lay exhausted against the hospital pillows, hair messy, face pale, and more beautiful to me than she had ever been beneath any streetlight. When I walked toward the bed with our daughter, Hannah immediately tried to sit up straighter. "She okay?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She's perfect." Hannah looked at me with a suspicious expression of someone who knew I was emotionally compromised. "You have to say that. I'm her father. Bias is now legally required." She smiled, and I lowered our daughter carefully into her arms. Watching Hannah hold her changed something in me that I still do not know how to explain without making it sound smaller than it was. Years earlier, she had been 26, and living hundreds of miles from the people she loved, trying to convince herself that moving away had not made her selfish. I had been a man who came home late enough that my house was mostly somewhere I slept. Now she was tracing one finger along our daughter's tiny cheek while I sat beside both of them, and the room felt more like home than any place I had ever lived. Hannah looked down at the baby and laughed softly when one little hand escaped the blanket. "She has your dramatic timing. She was born after 9 hours of labor, exactly. Made an entrance, then took her time. That sounds more like you." Hannah gave me a tired look. "I just had your child. Choose your next sentence carefully." I was still smiling when something beyond the window caught my attention. Snow had started falling, not heavily, just soft flakes drifting past the glass and disappearing against the ledge. For a while I watched without saying anything. Hannah noticed, because Hannah had been noticing me longer than I ever understood. "What?" she asked. I looked back at her. "Nothing. Lucas, you should rest. You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you stare at something and pretend you're not thinking." Even after all those years, apparently I had developed no new defenses. I looked toward the window again. I was thinking about that first night. Hannah followed my eyes and understood immediately. The streetlight. I nodded. "You standing there with snow all over your hair, asking me if you looked pretty." She smiled. "You looked terrified." I was exhausted. "You sat in your car staring at me for almost a full minute." I turned toward her. "Almost a minute?" Hannah's smile became suspiciously pleased. "Maybe 40 seconds. How would you know that?" She looked down at our daughter as if the baby had suddenly become fascinating. "Hannah, you took a long time to get out." "Wait." I leaned closer. "You saw me?" She finally looked at me again, and there was something wonderfully familiar in her expression. The same gentle teasing I had seen beneath that streetlight, only softer now, worn comfortably by the woman I had shared years of my life with. "Of course I saw you. You never told me that. You never asked. I thought you were out there looking at the snow." "I was." She paused, adjusted the blanket around our daughter, then added, "I was also hoping you'd get out of the car." For a moment, all I could hear was the quiet hospital room and the faint sound of our daughter breathing. That old night rearranged itself in my memory. I had always thought I was the one who noticed Hannah first, the one unexpectedly caught by the sight of her beneath the falling snow. I had imagined her completely unaware until she caught me staring. But she had seen my headlights turn onto the street. She had watched me park, and while I sat there wondering why I could not look away, she had been waiting for me to cross the distance between us. "You could have made this information available several years ago," I said. Hannah smiled. "Would it have changed anything?" I looked at her, then at our daughter asleep against her chest, then back at the snow outside. "Probably would made me even more unbearable." "Exactly. I made the responsible choice." I leaned over and kissed her forehead. She caught my hand before I moved away and held it against the blanket between us. Years ago, I thought the beautiful part of that night was Hannah standing beneath the streetlight while snow fell around her. It took me a long time to understand that beauty had very little to do with the light or the snow. The beautiful part was that I finally got out of the car. I walked toward her, she let me stay, and eventually all those small choices became this room, this woman, and the little girl sleeping between us.
Their daughter sleeping in Hannah's arms makes the beginning of Lucas and Hannah's story feel almost absurdly small. There was no grand introduction, only a snowy street, a neighbor standing beneath a light because her house felt too quiet, and Lucas finally getting out of his car. He answered one teasing question seriously, stayed beside her without trying to fix her homesickness, and discovered that being able to share silence with someone could matter more than having the perfect thing to say. After that night, their relationship grew through routines neither of them could point to as a single turning point. Coffee appeared on front steps, packages crossed the short distance between their doors, soup showed up after late work nights, and each of them quietly learned the shape of the other's days. Hannah was building a life away from her family, while Lucas had built one so self-contained that home was mostly the place he returned to sleep. Without either of them announcing it, they began making those separate lives less separate. Even Hannah's language changed as the new town slowly stopped feeling temporary. The second snowfall removed the last practical excuse. Hannah came to Lucas's door and deliberately brought him back beneath the same streetlight. This time she did not need comfort from an empty house, and Lucas did not let the setting make the whole decision for him. He offered his hand, Hannah took it, and both of them understood that months of ordinary closeness had become something they were finally willing to acknowledge. Neither needed a confession yet, because the choice itself was already clear. Then Chicago forced Lucas to decide what that acknowledgement actually meant. The offer looked like obvious progress on paper, more money, a larger company, and a bigger title. Hannah refused to turn herself into either the reason he stayed or the excuse he could resent later. She asked the simpler question he had somehow avoided. Did he actually want to go? Once Lucas stopped measuring his life only by the next promotion, he realized he had options where he was and, more importantly, a life he genuinely wanted to remain inside. He stayed, asked more from his current career instead of abandoning it, and finally told Hannah there was someone he wanted to come home to. Years later, marriage, a shared house, and their newborn daughter showed how far those choices had traveled. The final surprise was learning that on the very first snowy night, Hannah had noticed him too. While Lucas thought he was deciding whether to approach her, she had already been hoping he would get out of the car. What gives this story weight is that neither Hannah nor Lucas is asked to shrink a life in order to make the romance work. Hannah misses her family but still chooses the independence she moved for. Lucas cares about his career but eventually realizes ambition and automatic relocation are not the same thing. Their relationship becomes possible because both of them learn to distinguish what they actually want from what they assume forward progress is supposed to look like. Hannah's handling of the Chicago offer is especially important. She does not say, "Stay for me," even though she clearly wants him to stay. That forces Lucas to make a decision he can own. When he turns the job down, he is not sacrificing his future for her. He has already asked what growth could look like where he is and found another path. The romantic choice and the career choice stop being enemies. The newborn scene then lands because it is not presented as a reward for one dramatic decision. It is the result of dozens of smaller ones. Noticing, crossing the driveway, staying quiet together, reaching for a hand, asking a harder question, and choosing a life on purpose. The story's real romance is accumulation. There are several believable places to mark the beginning of Lucas and Hannah as something more than neighbors. Draw the line where you think it truly changed. The first snowy night, the quiet routines between their houses, the second trip to the streetlight, or Lucas choosing the life he wanted to keep. Tell me your pick below, and if their slow build worked for you, leave a like and subscribe for more.